No Peace Without Justice, a non-profit organization that seeks to promote human rights, democracy, rule of law, international justice, for the first of our 2 sessions. This event has been organized bearing in mind the need to highlight the uneven and dual impact of the conflict faced by the Palestinian women. They have not only borne the disproportionate impact of the conflict between Israel and Palestine, but their sufferings have been further aggravated by the entrenched patriarchal system within their societies. For over 7 decades, this double-edged sword has come to define their sufferings. But the feminists have pushed back against this narrative, determined to redefine the narrative, transforming themselves from being mere victims to agents of peace. With that being said, I'm honored to introduce our panel for tonight. We have with us Ms. Randa Senora, General Director, Women's Center for Legal Aid and Counseling, former Senior Executive Director, Independent Commission for Human Rights. Ms. Mariam Barghouti, a Palestinian researcher and writer. Ms. Suha Jarrad, Researcher and Advocacy Officer, Al-Haq Organization. And finally, our session chair for tonight, Professor A.K. Ramakrishnan, Professor, Center for West Asian Studies, School of International Relations, JNU. I would now like to invite Anushree Singh, Director of Research, Raisina House, to deliver the welcome address. Over to you, Anushree.
Thank you so much. Like life, peace begins with women. We are the first to forge line into alliance and collaboration across conflict divides. A very good evening or afternoon wherever you are in the world. I, Anushree Singh, Director Research, welcome you all on behalf of Raisina House, a registered, youth-led, independent policy research think tank based out of New Delhi, India. In this virtual roundtable discussion, the conflictual legacy of Palestinian women being organized in collaboration with No Peace Without Justice, Brussels. I take this opportunity to welcome the esteemed members of the panel, Mr. Frej Fareed, for addressing the topic. It is my honor to welcome Professor A.K. Ramakrishnan and the session chair for the session. I'm also glad to welcome Ms. Randa Senora, Ms. Mariam Barghouti, Ms. Suha Jarrad. The discussion today is the culmination of enormous effort of Palestinian women in their struggle. As typically in case with other armed conflicts, women have had and continue to bear the consequences of the protracted war between Israel and Palestine. Complicating the matters further is the duality of gender-based violence experienced by Palestinian women from Israeli forces, both men and women. Simultaneously, profoundly patriarchal societies like Palestine oppress and deny women's fundamental rights and dignity while exacerbating psychological and direct violence experienced throughout their existence. Ladies and gentlemen, tonight we will attempt to discuss on how we as members of the international community can undo what has been done for the last 7 decades. So without any further delay, I hand over the proceedings to someone. Over to you, Saman.
Thank you, Anushree. I would now like to request Mr. Frej Fareed, Regional Representative of No Peace Without Justice in the MENA region and the former Director of Asia, Pacific and MENA at the UN Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights in Geneva.
And Anushree, thank you very much for this introduction. Dear participants to this roundtable discussion on the conflictual legacy of Palestinian women, I would like to thank you to be with us. I would like to start by thanking all of you and by thanking our partner in the organization of this important event, the Raisina House, as well as Professor Ramakrishnan for accepting to moderate this roundtable discussion. For decades, Palestinian women have been at the fore of the struggle against Israeli occupation, settler colonialism, and apartheid. The recognition that the path to Palestinian liberation must embody the emancipation of each and every Palestinian, including women, was perhaps best put by the slogan of the Palestinian feminist movement, Talat, that there is no free homeland without free women. Over the past few years, Palestinian women have taken to the streets across their fragmented homeland and in exile to center the rights and dignity of women within their broader liberation struggle. Civil society have for years documented the devastating impacts of Israeli colonization on Palestinian women, including the gendered impacts of ongoing displacement and dispossession on both sides of the Green Line. Today, The imminent evictions by the Israeli occupying authorities in the Jerusalem neighborhood of Sheikh Jarrah are emblematic of Palestinian ongoing Nakba and the continued denial of their right of return. Another battle going on in Jerusalem today revolves around the upcoming Palestinian Authority elections and efforts to ensure that these can be held in Jerusalem and throughout the rest of the occupied Palestinian territory. Predictably, extensive pressure is being exerted by the Israeli occupation to prevent the Palestinian elections from taking place. Palestinian civil society has stressed the importance of the elections for restoring the Palestinian political system. For 15 years, the absence of the Palestinian Legislative Council has meant an erosion of the rule of law-based system and separation of powers, a situation further worsened by the state of political division between the West Bank and Gaza Strip. Palestinian women are represented in lists for the upcoming elections, but we are yet to see how Palestinian women's participation will be meaningfully integrated into the political process. At this event, we will listen to 3 prominent women human rights defenders from Palestine, among them Ms. Suha Jarrar, who is also a victim and witness of gender-based violence committed by Israel, the occupying authorities, and whose mother is still in detention. I would like to thank the 3 of them for joining us today and wish you a fruitful discussion and encourage all of you to ask questions and to interact with our great speakers. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. With that, I would now like to hand over the session to our chair, Dr. Ramakrishnan. Over to you, sir. So you.
Yeah, thank you, Saman. Can you hear me? I'm extremely glad to be here and waiting to listen to the 3 very powerful women from Palestine who will be speaking about their perspective on things and their experiences. As far as I'm concerned, and many of us are concerned, our understanding of the Palestine question is not only a political question, but also an ethical question, which have been bothering
I'm
us
sorry,
across the
sir.
world.
Sorry to interrupt you, sir. Mr. Ansari, can you please turn off your mic? Sorry for the interruption, sir.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay. So there is an ethical dimension to the Palestine question, along with the political dimension, in the sense that, Palestine, for all these decades, almost more than a century of its struggle, have been in our hearts. Whether that political and ethical solidarity with Palestine is still to the level to which it should actually be is a real question. It's a question that we should ask ourselves in different countries of the world. The Palestinian women who have shown tremendous courage. Suha Jarrar is here. Her mother Khalida is still under Israeli detention. You could see the innumerable women in Palestinian history and in contemporary times showing immense courage to resist both the Zionist Israeli colonialism and the kind of patriarchal violence that's unleashed by occupying colonial forces on the one hand and various forms of social dominations of the patriarchal kind on the other. And everyday violence affecting the flow of normal life, the everyday life of women. These points, the questions of access to health, and going to hospital itself. Women had to deliver at checkpoints in various cases, as we know, and the access to education. All these are affecting the everyday lives of women. Not only the psychological issues concerning occupation, not only of the land, but of the very process of asserting Palestinian identity. If anybody now talks in support of Palestine, is being branded as an anti-Semitic and so on at the global level. Kind of force of domination that's coming from forces that wants to silence the Palestinian voice, particularly the Palestinian women's voice, because that's much more powerful at ethnic level, because we have seen that in the first Intifada, we have seen that at various junctures of Palestinian struggle, and therefore this is a moment of coming together to talk about those experiences of women's everyday struggles and the feminist kind of politics that Palestinian women project. And I'm extremely happy to be part of this discussion, and I'm very proud to be, sharing this meeting with people like Randa, Suha, and Mariam. I've read many pieces written by Mariam Darwoti on Palestine issue, various aspects of it, and the women in Palestine in particular. I've watched the struggles of Suha resisting the Israeli attack on her own family at various points of time. Randa's own work, I've been in Cairo for, I think the same time when you were there, your work on Palestinian women workers. I remember those works, your thesis on that.
Oh my God.
It's
very
textile workers, if my memory is correct.
Yes.
So, just to note that these are women who have shown courage, openly came out, wrote about, spoke about the conditions of the Palestinians and the need to have a free, independent, normal life in their own homeland. May I now call upon Randa Signora to address the meeting.
Thank you very much. Good evening, good afternoon to everybody. And it is my great pleasure to be with you today. I would like to thank the Rasina House and the No Peace Without Justice for inviting me, and especially my friend Faraj for inviting me for this special event. roundtable discussion, which I hope I can reflect on many of the issues that have been said. I was so happy that you mentioned, the work I've done when I was doing my master's degree in Cairo about women in the textile economy, because it also addressed, that was really between 85 and 87. So you can tell how long I've been a feminist and a human rights defender, working on issues related to women in the textile economy at the time, but linking it with the dependent economy, which Palestinian women live in the occupied Palestinian territory, and our economy heavily depending on this subcontracting industry, which really meant women have been the most exploited among others, because they had to work in and being invited to the labor market, but then the first ones to be thrown out of the market when there is no jobs, because their work was always temporary and so on. And that was the life which I have lived since I was very young, being under Israeli military occupation until today. I was hoping that my son and his grandchildren our children will have a better life, but unfortunately we've been living I lived most of my life under Israeli military occupation, with all its implications on all the Palestinian population, but specifically on Palestinian women and girls, which has restricted most of their lives and impacted them in many different ways. Palestinian women typically live their lives at the intersection of two significant trends: the patriarchal structures within the Palestinian society on one hand, and the detrimental effects of the Israeli military occupation on the other hand. And now the added third impact of the COVID-19, which exacerbated all structural inequalities even further. In Palestine, women already faced a patriarchal high prevalence of gender-based violence, which was further exacerbated by the Israeli occupation. The 2019 survey carried out by the Palestinian Central Bureau of Statistics found out that 29% of the Palestinian women had experienced some form of gender-based violence carried out by their husband in the past 12 months. It also revealed 57% of currently or even of ever married women had experienced psychological violence by their husbands at least once in the past 12 months. The equivalent figure for physical violence was 18%, and sexual violence at 9%. 53 several known risk factors of gender-based violence has been significantly exacerbated by COVID-19. The increase in gender-based violence is one of the factors that had impacts of also further by COVID-19, especially with the blocking the access to justice. Civil courts and the Sharia courts looking into family matters have been interrupted, and access to justice has been dramatically impacted, having devastating effects for women across Palestine or in the occupied territory. Access to justice remains the basic human rights to be safeguarded, and also serves as a fundamental means of accessing and enjoying of all other rights. With an already fragile economy and high employment, Palestinian women particularly susceptible to the economic crisis that has followed in the weeks of COVID-19. The lockdown restrictions have led to closure of businesses and loss in livelihoods, affecting the people throughout the West Bank, but specifically women in East Jerusalem, in Area C, areas which are still under the control of the Israeli occupation, and women specifically who have been the first ones again to be thrown out of the market because they work in the informal sector or in the businesses that are not well paid and are not officially organized. Also, the year 2020, which have seen a dangerous trend of backtracking in the emancipation of women, Gender roles and division of labor and responsibilities are already rigid and widespread in the Palestinian society. According to the traditional patriarchal structures, women are often considered are not in the decision-making positions, but are seen as the main caregivers and are responsible for the household and the maintenance of the provision of the unpaid care. This has further exacerbated the responsibilities of women in our society during COVID-19, especially with men and sometimes the perpetrators of gender-based violence being locked down at homes with their own wives, and therefore increasing gender-based violence during these situations. What makes the situation even further difficult is the Israeli most flagrant violations of international humanitarian law that has already been explored all over. I have been practiced all over the years of occupation, but during COVID-19 and the closures, in addition to the blockade that is being imposed on the Gaza Strip for over almost 15 years now, Palestinian women have been denied access to medical care, to movement, freely moving movement. Now this is further complicated and has a multi-layer impact on women because many women with chronic diseases are being abandoned by their most beloved ones within the very much entrenched patriarchal structures, resulting in the sufferings of Israeli restrictions on access to medical care and being abandoned within a patriarchal society. The entire year had witnessed serious violations of human rights, including house demolitions, which has increased during 2020 by 25%, around 25%. When we were talking about the household being the most safe place when we have been locked in during COVID-19, houses have been demolished, structures have been demolished, making the Palestinian people suffer further by finding no place to go for, and further increasing the responsibilities on all the members of the family, but specifically women who had to manage the home with all the difficulties entailed, being more entitled to take the responsibility of the children and the family and the household. This has further been complicated by settler violence and settler attacks on everyone, but specifically on Palestinian women who are around the homes and around the agricultural land, around their own homes, and therefore suffering from all the implications of the occupation and the settler violence over their agricultural land and their own resources. And women, again, with the scarcity of water resources, have to manage the home with these scarce resources available. This has been also combined with nitrates, with the Israeli arrest of the children and the house arrest of the children, which continued in all areas, especially in area H2 in the Gaza, in the Hebron area, in the old city of Hebron, and in East Jerusalem, which has been illegally annexed by the Israeli occupation. What I'm trying to highlight in this is that the Palestinian women had to face three main challenges: the occupation on one hand, patriarchal structures, and the COVID-19, all of them very much linked with each other, with Israel restricting the movement of Palestinians during COVID-19, and with the checkpoint system at one hand, but also with the COVID-19 and the lockdown at homes, further exacerbating the sufferings of everyone, but specifically women, who had to manage all of these difficult situations, including the economic hardships that have long-term impact on everyone, but specifically on women, as I've mentioned earlier. This combined with the increased gender-based violence entailed additional difficulties to women, and taking all of that into consideration, I think that while the impact of the whole situation is being under such a prolonged military occupation, who have not taken up their legal obligations for providing the medical care and currently the vaccination for the Palestinian population living under this apartheid discriminatory system, entailed that the sufferings of the whole Palestinian civilian population is further increasing. I mean, with the current pandemic, which is affecting globally the whole world. To sum up my presentation, and I'm then ready for other discussions, the interplay between these three factors together are very clear, especially with Palestinian women married to Jerusalemites who are under a different legal system than the other parts of the occupied territory, who had to remain in the vicious circle of gender-based violence because they cannot move freely. And with the COVID-19, the whole permit system, which is heavily dependent on the husbands to apply for the Israelis to reside in their own homes, they have been denied medical care, they have been denied visitations to their families in other parts of occupied territory, and they had to endure violence at the household in order not to leave their homes, and then cannot be do not have the possibility of re-entering into the city because they heavily depend on their husbands to provide it, to apply for the Israeli system, to Israeli interior office to get these permits. So all in all, while it is one component, the interrelated relationship and combined multi-layered oppression under which Palestinian women live, especially being under occupation, further exacerbates the daily sufferings of Palestinian women, which really makes us mostly in need for a just and durable solution for the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and our engagement in decision-making and in conflict resolution in order to be able to have a better life for us and for all our people and our children in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Naman, we can have a discussion at the end.
Yes, sir. We'll have
About
questions at the
presentation?
end of the discussion. Once all the panelists have finished making their presentations, we'll open the round, open it up to questions from the audience, and we'll go from there.
Okay. Okay. So, and I now invite Suha Jarrah for her presentation.
Thank you, Faraj, and thank you everyone. Randa, also for your great intervention. That was really insightful as well. Thank you so much for having me too, and for the organizers for organizing this very important event. And I just want to highlight that the reason why I thought it was important today to shed light on Palestinian women prisoners within the context of today's session is multifold. But first and most importantly, we are talking about women human rights defenders who are being illegally detained and prosecuted for their mere involvement in the freedom movement and the movement to end Israel's illegal occupation. Throughout history of the Palestinian cause, Palestinian women have been, as you mentioned, Fajr, also in your introduction, have been at the center of the liberation movement in all aspects of the struggle. And they have played a particularly meaningful role in prisoners' movements behind bars historically as well, including, for example, leading hunger strikes and also introducing and leading educational programs and continuing the struggle for freedom from behind bars. I also want to note that tomorrow marks Palestinian Prisoners' Day, which is a day where we and the international community, the community as well, express solidarity with all of our Palestinian political prisoners. it's important. It's also important here to keep in mind as we go on from here that all Palestinian prisoners, including women and girls, are detained in prisons that are located outside of the 1967 occupied territory. And this is in violation of international law, in particular of Article 76 of the Fourth Geneva Convention, which clearly stipulates that an occupying power must detain residents of the occupied territory in prisons inside the occupied territory. So the occupying power is not legally allowed to remove prisoners from inside of the occupied territory where they reside. All Palestinian prisoners currently, including women, are tried also in Israeli military courts, meaning the prosecution and the judge and the Israeli military personnel who are active members of sustaining the occupation in itself and sustaining and maintaining Israel's apartheid regime over the Palestinian as a whole are all part of this military court and this military system. And Palestinians are tried inside this system. So this is just to give an idea of the proportion here as well. Palestinian women detainees also represent all facets of the Palestinian society. They include parliamentarians, they include leaders, journalists, social workers, activists, students, mothers, daughters, caregivers, health care workers, amongst many other positions or professions. And between 1967, at the beginning of the occupation, and 2020, more than 10,000 Palestinian women were jailed by the Israeli authorities for political reasons or for their involvement in Palestinian resistance. And this figure includes Palestinian women who hold Israeli citizenship, Palestinian Jerusalemites as well, and Palestinian women living under direct Israeli military occupation in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. And as of today, there are 37 Palestinian women and girls who are detained inside Israeli prisons and detention centers, including 6 wounded prisoners who are often wounded by Israeli forces during arrest, many times by shooting using live ammunition. There are also 12 mothers inside Israeli prisons and 3 administrative detainees. And I want to take a moment here to elaborate on that and what administrative detention is. Administrative detention is detention that is based on secret material, meaning secret evidence, secret files, secret charges, to which neither the prisoner nor their legal counsel have access. So even the defense lawyer does not have access to this material. The person is held without a charge and without trial and can be held indefinitely. And this is because administrative detention can be renewed indefinitely by the Israeli authorities. Historically, Palestinians have spent as long as 10 years held under Israeli prisons, held inside Israeli prisons under administrative detention, again, without facing any charges. It's important to keep in mind also that Israel's arbitrary use of administrative detention in particular is a form of psychological torture that is inflicted on Palestinian human rights defenders. And that is in part because of its indefinite nature. Israel's systematic use of this type of detention, administrative detention, against Palestinians also constitutes a flagrant violation of international law. And while the Fourth Geneva Convention does allow some use of administrative detention by an occupying power, Sorry. Oh, I thought I was being interrupted there. That's okay. While the Fourth Geneva Convention allows detention and the fact that it's without trial, without charge, even though the Fourth Geneva Convention does allow the use of administrative detention, it allows it under very strict conditions. And These are routinely violated by the Israeli occupation and the Israeli practice of administrative detention, because Israel simply does not comply with the convention's restrictions on the use of administrative detention. Willfully depriving a protected person of the rights of fair and regular trial is also a grave violation of the convention, and Israel's deprivation of fair trial it is also in violation of fundamental rules of international law, which further constitute war crimes and crimes against humanity under the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court as well. Administrative detention is also, as routinely practiced by Israel, violates several provisions of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. And on that, I just want to give one example. Of course, I know that we said that there are 3 women, but I know that there's no room here to cover or to give examples on every simple case. One example is Khitam Saafin, who is one woman who is being currently held under administrative detention. This is her 2nd arrest, and she was arrested from her home in November of 2020. She was held under administrative detention for 4 months, which was again renewed on March 1st for an additional 4 months, March 1st of 2020. Her arrest is a mere product of her active role as a Palestinian leader. She is the head of the Union of the Palestinian Women's Committees. She's a secretariat member of the General Union of Palestinian Women and a prominent Palestinian human rights defender. And her work is well known at the regional and international levels. She's also active in the World Social Forum as well. And the criminalization of mere affiliation or membership with a political party, let's say, or civil activism, violates fundamental international conventions because such activities are protected under the freedoms of belief and association. Israel's use of arbitrary detention often also violates parliamentarian immunity. And I'm glad that the Palestinian elections were mentioned at the beginning of this, because it is important to also highlight that the participation in a democratic, quote unquote, democratic decision-making process and a democratic electoral process and a participation in the political process for women does not mean that it comes without a price. For example, and as mentioned before, my mother is one of these people. She's a member of the Palestinian Legislative Council. Her very first imprisonment was before I was born. It was in 1989, and it was on International Women's Day, and it was for her participation in an International Women's Day demonstration. She was snatched from the demonstration and was imprisoned, and she spent 1 month there. She's a Palestinian civil society leader and a prominent human rights defender. I don't want to seem like I'm talking about my mom, but these are well-known facts also about her as well. Particularly, she's active in relation to Palestinian prisoners, and she's very active in relation to that file. She is still the head of the Prisoners Committee of the Palestinian Legislative Council, and she was appointed for the Palestinian National Committee for the follow-up on the International Criminal Court file. She has since been subject to a wave of harassments, especially after her appointment to the ICC National Committee. In 2014, by the way, before all of this, she also received a travel ban because of her international activism representing Palestine. So she has not been able to travel since 1999. So complete travel ban, restriction on freedom of movement, completely. Even when she was very ill and she needed to be treated outside of Palestine because we did not have the proper equipment. It was only after there was a huge international campaign to allow her to go to Jordan that she was allowed to go to Jordan to receive treatment, and she was allowed to be only be escorted with Israelis to and from the hospital. So a very restricted movement as well. In 2014, the Israeli occupying forces raided my family's home in the middle of the night. Of course, they always do it in the middle of the night. And they handed her an order to leave her place, our home in Ramallah, and move to the city of Jericho, which we have no affiliation with. We have absolutely nothing to do with Jericho. It's interesting to also say that it's from Area A to an Area A, but that's a whole other story. She protested this decision by protesting for over a month at the Palestinian Legislative Council building in Ramallah. She was actually sleeping there and on the couch because she did not want to go home. In response to that, and in response to the huge international solidarity campaign and local solidarity campaign, the occupying forces revoked the order. But less than a month after they revoked that order and we went back home, she was arrested and was first held under administrative detention. Then she was sentenced to 15 months in prison. Some of the charges in that imprisonment period, including attending a book fair. And they also included greeting released political prisoners, which is a custom that we do when Palestinian prisoners are released. We go and we greet them and we wish them well. And she's also the head of the prisoners committee. So it's part of her job to do that as well. Less than a year after her release, after those 15 months, she was arrested again and was held under administrative detention for 20 months. And then she was released. And then again, less than a year after that, she was arrested again from our home in Ramallah and was recently sentenced to 2 years in imprisonment. Her charge includes coordinating between the her political party that she represents at the Legislative Council and the Palestinian Liberation Organization, which is a part of her role as a parliamentarian. So this is just to give an example that Palestinian women who are part of the political scene, who are active in the political scene, are not exempt also from systematic harassment by the Israeli occupation on a regular and very vicious basis as well. Palestinian women are also subjected to many forms of physical and psychological ill treatment throughout the process of their arrest, leading up to their physical imprisonment in the prison. The occupying forces brutally arrest women during night raids, as I said, and under horrifying and terrorizing conditions for them and for their families, including children, which is something that we grew up with because my father has also been, my father spent 11 years under administrative detention, not consecutively, but in total. During interrogations, the Israeli occupation authorities subject Palestinian women to extremely humiliating and sometimes and many times illegal interrogation tactics. And these include prolonged stress positions. I don't know if you know what stress positions are, but they are basically positions where people are shackled in a position that applies a certain amount of stress to a certain part of the body for a very, very long time. So a type of torture. Sleep deprivation, physical assault, sexual harassment, verbal threats, and depriving, of course, women of their basic necessities and needs, including feminine hygiene products and access to washroom facilities, often using them as leverage. So Palestinian women prisoners are held right now, all of them, in the Moon prison. The Moon prison is a very, very old prison. It was built under the British mandate, and it was used to be a horse stable, a stable for horses. So they're held in the Moon prison under very harsh living conditions that do not align with the bare minimum of adequate living standards. For example, and this is just one example, the showers are located in the outside yard. And this is definitely a violation of their privacy as well. And they can only use the showers during the recess time, or I don't know if that's the right terminology, but during the time where they're allowed outside. Israeli prison services have placed an absolute ban on educational books, despite some prisoners' attempts to bring in university books to continue their education, because a lot of them are also university students. When an education program began, they were subject to arbitrary disciplinary measures, including solitary confinement and the banning of regular books, which are novels, which are usually allowed, from entering. These are just examples of the arbitrary measures that they're also subjected to inside the prison. Currently, there are 10 sick Palestinian prisoners, women prisoners, and 6 wounded, as I mentioned. The Israeli prison services adopt a systematic policy of medical negligence regarding Palestinian prisoners. In addition to that, they deny Palestinian women prisoners of cultural and gender-sensitive medical treatment, repeatedly dismissing their medical needs and disregarding their conditions through stalling medical tests and delaying diagnosis and things like that. Women prisoners note also ill treatment that is received at the hands of the prison doctors and nurses, whose treatment is proof of Israel's policies of apartheid and the discriminatory nature against Palestinian detainees. This policy of deliberate medical negligence is of even more pressing concern during a global pandemic. Once Israel became the leading country in vaccination rollout rate, Palestinian prisoners, including ill and older women, were systematically denied and excluded from the vaccination process. The lack of available hygiene products during the period of the pandemic as well was also repeatedly reported by women prisoners. They are all vaccinated now, but this was after months and months of regular campaigning for them to be vaccinated. And this is just a broad overview of the condition. I hope that I was able to deliver at least a little bit of, and this is only, again, this is a fraction of what women go through. It doesn't even scratch the surface, to be honest. And in the context of the commission of the crime of apartheid, Israel prosecutes Palestinian organizations and persons by depriving them of fundamental rights and freedoms because they oppose apartheid. And they do that through harassment, through arbitrary detention, through torture, through ill treatment, and through targeting Palestinians systematically, particularly human rights defenders who mobilize to challenge Israel's policies and its laws and practices of racial domination and oppression. Thank you for listening to me.
Thank you very much, Suhajada. We will have a discussion at the end. Those who wants to raise any question, please enter the question in the chat box. I would now invite Mariam Barghouti for her presentation. Mariam, please.
Thank you. And thank you, Suha and Ranta, for the informative discussion on Palestinian women. So I guess for my segment and to kind of close this panel, I will try to go a bit more broad. I think in the context of Palestine, in the context of feminism in Palestine, we may also inadvertently focus on women. But that's not what the feminist movement here is. And if you notice historically, Palestinian feminist movements with a focus on gender rights, with a focus on equality, with a focus on the right to confront, has risen when there's a stagnancy in national movements, right? It's in the 90s. You mentioned the Tala'at movement recently, and we need to notice that presently, the national movement, quote unquote, is non-existent. So placing the rise of feminist movements in their context shows how consistently in the Palestinian reality, women's issues are relegated to secondary issues, that we have to bring them up. Oh, okay, we're not fighting we're not bringing up the colonial context. Let's start bringing this up. But it also shows you how entwined women, feminism are with the reality of colonialism. Women historically have been associated with the reproductive role, with ensuring the lineage, the community. And more than that, in terms of feminist movements, you would notice a lot of them focused on community service, on mobilization. In the 90s, the education worked to promote engaging with the community, and this is so pivotal in Palestine, I think abroad, but in the colonial context where we're fragmented. Ms. Randa was speaking about this in the beginning, between Hebron and Jerusalem. It's not just Israeli colonialism through the soldiers that impacts Palestinians and families. It is the fact that if a woman is experiencing gender-based violence in her home, whether she's based in Jerusalem, whether she has an Israeli citizenship, whether she lives in Gaza, or whether she lives in the West Bank, dictates which authority to go to. And now imagine a Palestinian woman facing domestic violence within the Israeli system. I mean, the Israeli soldiers are torturing women and children and men. So how do you expect them to safeguard it on men? We really need to address these things within their more micro, banal context. Israel does not just, and interestingly enough, while we're talking about prisoners, 7 years ago today, I was being released from Hasharon prison after I was being detained for a week. I was 21 years old and I was being detained for a week because another 20-so-year-old Israeli soldier decided to fabricate charges against me. And I remember for the longest time, I wouldn't speak about this story because I say it was just a week. And it shows you the severity of the Palestinian experience under colonialism, where women, children, men, and elderly are being held for such extended periods of time. And as Suha was just saying, 10 years under no charges, with no evidence held against you. And it becomes, we internalize and we start this hierarchy of suffering. Oh, it's just a week. Well, the point about bringing these issues up, especially with a focus on Palestinian women in conflict, is to say 1 hour is enough. That I don't have to sit here and go through the statistics for everyone. The narrative is there. And what I think in the beginning, it was noted that Palestinians are trying to assert their identity. And I will disagree with that. And I'm going to go ahead and say Palestinians are defining their identity. And there is no fixed identity. It's constantly transforming. Ms. Renda's generation with women's movements and feminism is vastly different than mine. And mine is vastly different than the coming generation. Earlier, I was speaking with a high school student, a young girl, Nala Saeed, and I asked her, hey, you know, what is feminism for your generation? What is feminism for your generation? And she looks at me and says, I don't know if anyone really knows what feminism means these days. And it was so significant for me because especially when we're speaking about things like feminist movements, I'm not representative of the Palestinian feminist movement. Suha is not representative. Ms. Randa is not representative. And we need to bring that back in, that the colonial reality is bigger than its speakers. It's bigger than its representatives. And women are, the Palestinian, I guess, experience, the gendered experience of colonialism is not just the human rights defenders. And let us be careful with that, that we had to emphasize that we are advocates for human rights because we are so deeply criminalized as a people, that this is what keeps us safe. That we have to not just say, well, we're fighting as Palestinians in Palestine, that we have to create a new identity of human rights defenders because that's respected under international law, because that is the framework that we work in. And that's what colonialism relies on. Not everyone in Israeli detention is a human rights defender. Some of them are young boys that are 11 and 12 years old. I don't think they know what human rights are. And we need to realize that when we're speaking about history and the present and colonialism. The most sinister part, I think, about gendered oppression is the weaponizing of internal patriarchy against the population. So Palestinian women are not just sexually assaulted, harassed, tortured, and abused as detainees. They're also used. Their ability to bear witness is used against them. Male prisoners are held, and the first thing in the past, and now to a more psychologically manipulated way, are threatened with their mothers, with their sisters, so they can emphasize that masculinity in Palestinian men. And what that does, and there have been studies conducted on the link between patriarchy and colonialism and how they mutually reinforce. And if we want to speak about colonialism, and I think here people from the Indian audience knows about colonialism and its brutality, so I don't need to lecture you. But it's so entrenched in each other. It was the colonialism of the white man that even within their context, that the gender dimension is so maimed that it becomes a weapon. And I really think we need to start speaking about these things instead of just focusing on smaller points to go bigger. Because in the end, I'm sure any story I share as a woman from my experience is going to resonate with many. Maybe it's not the same, but it will resonate because I can feel people nodding their heads and saying, yeah, I can see that. So it's not exclusive to Palestine. And when I speak about whether it's Palestinians broadly or women or youth, I try to link it to the global. Because in the end, let's say we do liberate Palestine. What does that mean if by then I am still unable to stand, for instance, with my brothers and sisters in Kashmir? If I'm going to be afraid to speak out about things like the Indian occupation of Kashmir, how do I expect others to speak out against the Israeli colonization of Palestine, right? So it's a conversation, it's a going back and forth, and that's why I'm trying not to focus on the statistics, because in the end, if the impetus behind any solidarity effort, behind the willingness to understand, is because of a list, then where do we draw the line? Where do we see that one life is enough, not 500 or 1,000 or 500,000? And that's why I try to deviate away from that. The Palestinian feminist experience taught me that. And I think that's something that's very special about the movements here in terms of mobilizing within a colonial reality. We're fighting not just the Israeli soldiers, the men, but we're also fighting the women who are saying, oh, look at us, we're feminists carrying a gun and shooting at you. Very proudly, very, very proudly, like, oh, we have equality with men on that level. And Israel monopolizes on that. Look, our women are in the army. The Palestinian women, oof, oppressed by their culture. And these are, I think, the conversations that we need to start having more. Obviously, I don't have all the answers. I don't have all the explanations. And there is no way I can capture every experience of mine or the Palestinian community. But I think if we go larger than just speaking about how brutal Israel's systemic violence is, and start speaking more about us, our voices as us, and our experiences beyond, how many of us have been killed, might help a little more in moving towards actual solutions. Because what's the purpose of this roundtable if it is not to kind of inspire us to think of solutions forward, inspire us to learn more about one another, to speak out. People often don't speak out because they don't feel like they have a community to hold them. And I think that's, if we want to speak about also feminist movements, it's not just the challenges we face, it's these lessons that we can extend to each other, which I believe are very powerful. What is more powerful than community? And that's where I would like to end my talk and the three panelists. So thank you.
Thank you, Mariam Barghouti, for your take, your perspective on the feminist position that you take. And I remember reading one of your pieces where you stated that, if you can't be a Zionist and a feminist together. So that sharing of the experience with other women, that kind of solidarity, where there should be that critical content against colonial position. Feminist is valuable in that critical content, and that's where people can speak about that internationally.
استنى شوي لأنه في 10 أسئلة إلي. بلاش قضية.
Saman, can we go into the points of discussion now?
We can, sir. As long as all the panelists are ready, we'll open it up to questions.
Okay. Can they see the chat box? Some of those.
Yeah, we did.
Questions? Okay.
Can I say something before we start with the chat box? And I just want to approve what Mariam was speaking. I mean, we have to look more out of just to link the issues more in depth to understand the realities of feminism in our own society, and should be understood. It should be understood in a wider context, in understanding colonial occupation and its interplay with patriarchal structures, the imbalance of powers within our society, how they feed into each other, and how they impact everyday life. I think I fully agree with the approach that we should not get too much involved and indulged into numbers, because it's statistics and numbers, because sometimes that makes us lose the core issue addressed being at stake, which is understanding the implications, whether direct or long-term implications on the daily lives of everyone, but specifically how they are impacting women and girls in our own communities, in our own society. Because now there's a very big trend to go for statistics and numbers and to prove your point by saying that you are on the defense. You don't see the in-depth analysis behind the intersectional relationship between different factors and the imbalance of power in favor of colonialism controlled by. It's another phase of patriarchal structures that are in our own society, and each one of them enhances the other. The example you gave about bringing in the masculinity of men through threatening with sexual harassment to women as a tool for war. Women are being used as a tool for war, and in conflict situations, we are bearing the brunt of the conflicts, of the wars and occupation. And we have to understand it in this wider perspective in order to be able to find our way out as a feminist movement and also as a national movement. What I don't agree with Mariam about is that whenever the national movement is fading or that the feminist movement comes in, I see that there is a very interrelated relationship between both of them. And that's why you find now that because there is a very big regression to the national movement, they are not standing in the face of the counter campaign, the more traditional, conservative, Islamic, fundamentalist political parties that are attacking the feminist movement. And we are at the forefront without the support of the political parties at one hand, and the political leadership at the other hand. So we are caught between occupation, colonial occupation, patriarchal structures, power struggles that are imbalanced and are not in our favor. All of them have a very strong interplay together. Thank you. And then we see how you want to go through the chat box and the questions. Because
Professor, if it's all right, I'll read out the questions, and accordingly, whichever panelists feel most confident in answering those, depending on their expertise, they can do so.
Yeah,
so
that will be nice.
All right. So the very first question is, when we're talking about the gendered impact of the conflict, can we discuss and elaborate on it more in the post-COVID scenario, perhaps? And what does that mean going forward for the Palestinian women?
Yeah.
Who wants to take that up?
Mariam? No?
Yes, I can go ahead and elaborate a little bit more on that. The thing is, if we want to speak about the gendered impact post-COVID, you really have to go pre-COVID, right? Because what happened isn't that there were new dynamics created, dynamics were exacerbated, they were made more visible. Sometimes oppression becomes so blatant that you really can't hide it anymore, right? And in times of crisis where everyone is yelling, you can somehow hear an echo and you realize something is wrong. I think post-COVID, what we really realized about the gendered impact of the occupation is that it focuses on, so colonialism focuses on fragmentation, right? Divide and conquer, that I think many of us are very familiar about. And it is not just a fragmentation of land, it is not just a fragmentation of communities, it is the fragmentation of the family. A lot of the impact of COVID, the brunt of it was placed on women, and we were speaking about this earlier, it was touched up upon, that, you know, there's the Arab World for Research and Development collaborated with UN Women, and they wrote a gendered, the gendered impact of COVID-19. I was lucky enough to participate in that study, and it showed how women bore the brunt of handling COVID, from the basics of making sure sanitization and cleanliness in the home, to the ensuring that children continue their e-learning experiences and education. And these all, they hold a toll on the women, right? Which also, as within the Palestinian community, the woman is also the primary caregiver within the household, right? So it places that burden on her, and that fragments the family. And I think the Israeli authorities really monopolized on that. You saw the increased arrests with children, the raids also happening more, and a lot of that was placed on you know, the woman to kind of keep the together. I think post-COVID, we saw a lot of fragmentation in that because of the burdens. So we have to also remember that people often, so there's I once wrote a profile piece on Dr. Hanan Ashrawi, and one of the issues she touches up upon, you know, she is one of the first women in Palestinian legislation and a representative of the Palestinian people. She said there's something called woman super syndrome. So to enter politics, you have to be a superwoman, you have to be exemplary and excellent in all areas of life, as a mother, as a wife, as a teacher, as a scholar, as a politician, as a writer, as all of these things, that it kind of beats you down. And we forget that what Israel does isn't it detains us or it bombs Gaza or cuts the electricity off. It keeps putting these shocks, these burdens on us to fix. But the resources are shrinking. And I think COVID showed that we didn't have, Suha was speaking about how they don't give hygiene products in prison. Well, they don't give hygiene products in the West Bank either. And we forget that the Palestine that we know in lands is a big prison. It is not just behind the bars. The Allenby Bridge, the only entry exit route for Palestinians in the West Bank, was closed, not By Palestinian choice, no, by Israeli choice as well, by Jordanian choice as well. Gaza, by, you know, Egyptian choice as well, by Israeli choice, it is. No one can leave. Isn't that a prison? And I think that's what COVID showed, how subtle the patriarchal oppression, the chaining of people is, that I think we saw just very blatant during COVID. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, you know, I just want to say one, just one sentence to say that nothing was new about the post-COVID situation is the pre-COVID situation. It only became more visible and further exacerbated or intensified. Only, it only showed the impact of the occupation on the lives of everyone, but specifically on Palestinian women, because the whole control of the occupation and the colonial control has been only more visible to everybody. It further intensified it and increased the burdens on women. I just want to give one example to show how they intertwine together. The Palestinian speaker coming up during the daily reporting would come up and say that we're getting COVID-19 from the workers, Palestinian laborers working inside Israel, and that we have to control the situation, but they know that the Israelis are controlling that situation and not them. And then he comes up with a messaging to women that they have to control their husbands when they come back from Israel, and that they have to prevent them from, they have to lock down themselves in order not to, for the virus to spread out and that this is the role they intensify or they emphasize the role of women, that they have to control the movement of their husbands, not understanding that they cannot do that. In one of the incidents that we received on our free line helpline was of a woman who listened to the spokesperson, who, when she prevented her husband from going to the coffee shop when he returned back from Israel, she was beaten up. She was beaten up because coming up with this messaging to women without understanding that they do not really have the power to make decisions within the household, within a patriarchal society, and that they cannot control the movement of their husbands. And their husbands cannot be controlled because the Israelis are controlling all of that, and all of the complexities of that together, the women had to bear the brunt of that, all the care situations and so on. The health system, if I take the other question quickly about the health infrastructures that hurt everybody and is being used by the enemy as a tool, against everyone. The whole health system, especially in the Gaza Strip, being under a blockade for over 15 years, really entailed that health referral system is under the control of the occupation. It is more complicated for women when they need to be referred to hospitals in Jerusalem, in the West Bank, or abroad through the Egyptian borders, Rafah borders. So the total result is that women have to bear first of all, if they get sick, they have to bear the problem of the Israeli control of the permit system for the referral system. But also, they have to accompany the sick and the wounded or whatever who are in need of help. And this is where, again, the whole lack of control over the whole health system with the Israeli occupation controlling the borders and the permit system within the West Bank and Jerusalem and all of that all together really create a lot of problems for women to have access to proper medical care. Women married to Jerusalemites during COVID-19 were not able to get the necessary medication because they have their permits expired. The Israelis prevented new permits to be issued, and therefore they were caught between trying to stay in Jerusalem, and they cannot commute to the West Bank because they have overstayed their permits, but at the same time they were left without medical care in Jerusalem, for example, but as well as in the other parts of the West Bank. So in all together, what I'm trying to say is that the Israeli occupation controls the whole lives of everybody, especially the health system and the health services to everybody, including many times preventing women from receiving the necessary permits to accompany the sick or the wounded people that need referral to other parts of the occupied territory.
Can I just elaborate very quickly on what has been said, also just building on what Randa is saying and what Mariam is saying. Post-COVID is a continuation of pre-COVID, right? It's an exacerbation of the situation that we're facing. I just want to give an example though here, which is an important example because it is a reflection of Israel's annexationist policies in order to expand its settlement enterprise and permanently annex the land. That is very important. And this example is demolition. We have noticed and we have documented a high spike, very, very high spike in demolitions, in the demolitions of homes during the pandemic. And this, of course, bears with it a huge burden on women, and it has in the past, of course, but this burden was exacerbated. Women are expected to provide shelter, to provide food, to provide hygiene and sanitation. Women are expected to be at the top of the pyramid when it comes to maintaining the or intacting the household, right, and the family. And this spike in demolitions definitely had an impact on women as well, and on their expected role as caregivers and caretakers, and this was definitely something that we felt that we need to also document in detail, because demolitions are part of demolitions, whether in Area C, which falls under Israel's full jurisdiction, or demolitions in East Jerusalem as well. We have noticed a high spike in these demolitions, and Israel, in one way or another, actually used the pandemic. It took advantage of the pandemic in order to continue these annexationist policies. And the demolitions are part of these annexationist policies, annexationist practices. And the annexation practices are for the sole purpose of expanding the illegal settlement enterprise in the West Bank, and for permanently annexing the land. So here we can kind of see like a connection between everything that we're talking about here. So this is something that I kind of just wanted to emphasize on, just building on what Randa and Mariam have talked about as well, which have left women with, I mean, a huge burden during the pandemic, especially.
Thank you. So we've discussed about the international aspect of the conflict, and we've discussed about what the international law says in regards to the conflict and the way the women are treated. So keeping that in mind, a question has been raised about what the international community has done to alleviate the suffering of the Palestinian women, and really have they been effective at all?
I don't know, Brenda, do you want to take this first, and then I can?
Yeah. Okay, Sana. Okay, Sana. Well, actually, we are not. We don't think that that the international community still has met its legal and moral obligations towards the Palestinian population living under such a prolonged military occupation. Although I don't want to be very pessimistic, because we are seeing progress being made in moving forward now with the investigations of the International Criminal Court, which has been really very much obstructed by for such a long period of time. Now there is a little hope with the decision of the prosecution or the court to start investigation into war crimes committed against the Palestinians over the past since 2014, because this is when we acceded to the Rome Statute, and this is from where we can take it up from there. Of course, there are numerous dozens of resolutions that have been adopted by the General Assembly, by the Security Council, by the Human Rights Council, that are in support of the Palestinian right to self-determination and to their right against the Israeli settler violence, against the Israeli incursions on Gaza and the wars that have been imbalanced wars that have been marched since 2008 over the years, and the fact-finding missions, Goldstone report, and then now the Marches of Return report, which heavily, sets the ground for some of the issues that are being addressed by or investigated currently by the International Criminal Court. I think that we have to depend more on solidarity of the peoples. I see that Omar Barghouti is with us, and maybe he can tell you about the BDS movement and how much progress we have been able to do with the support of all the solidarity groups worldwide in order to conduct this peaceful campaign against the Israel. We have to make the Israelis pay the price for their occupation, and I think only through the BDS boycott, divestment, sanctions, we can, sanctions, we can take we can really find another tool where we can find solidarity and real payment of the price by the Israelis for their prolonged military occupation, their exhaustion of our resources, and all the serious violations of international law, human rights and humanitarian law conflicted against the Palestinians. So while I think that much more needs to be done, we should admit that we did a lot of progress, and in our process towards exposing the Israeli military occupation, one of a kind, such a prolonged military occupation, belligerent occupation, that, we have to use all the tools that we have. But perhaps the most important one is the solidarity of the peoples of the world, rather than expecting much from the powerful states, either within the United Nations system or generally, who have their own political and economic interests with Israel or the United States or whatever. Thank you.
Yeah, I think you summed it
How
up.
much more time we have?
Sorry.
8:40 already.
So we have time to take just a couple more questions, and I think we can close the panel.
Okay. So
I think Randa summed it up.
Some of these questions can be taken up together so that
yes, sir.
Can respond to that.
So if you'd like to do that, if you'd like to club these questions together as you feel fit, and then you can direct those questions to the concerned speaker accordingly, so we can perhaps wrap it up quickly, and that way most of the questions get answered to the best of their ability.
Okay. One question is on the connection between internal patriarchy and occupation. that is already addressed in various ways by the speakers. The other one is about neocolonialism, whether it's neocolonialism or colonialism proper. So you can see those questions there. The other one is, again, this is in a way addressed the gendered impact of the conflict. But if you want to add on that, and then there is a question on whether organizing women, forming organization in itself will do, because organizing itself is a difficult task. So what further can be done with respect to that point on forming women's organizations? There is also the question, general questions on the first step towards resolving the conflict. So some of these things, and there is one point on anti-Zionism being perceived as anti-Semitic. So on that point as well. So you can take some of these things and respond, so that I don't see Mariam here. She has left, I think. So if Suha and Randa would address some of these issues, then after that we can wind. Suha first.
Start, Suha, you want to start?
I think, Randa, you can go ahead, given your expertise and also your very long experience with the Palestinian struggle and also the feminist movement within Palestine. I'm looking at the questions. They are very broad. I have a lot of thoughts, but I will give the floor to Randa first, and then if I have any additions, I'll go.
Okay. Randa, please.
Actually, when we speak about always trying to link with anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism, it is obviously a political tool for our enemies to use it in order to close the, using what happened in Europe with the Holocaust, like to really threaten everybody to open their mouth and speak about the injustices under which the Palestinian people have been living over decades now, under first of all taking most of their the sufferings of 1948 with our it was the Zionist plan has been perceived since the 19th century onwards, in order to control the Palestinian land and find a Palestinian home for the Jewish people at the expense of the other people. And I always say that we should not be, nobody should be scared with bringing in the anti-Semitic part, because here we're talking about an injustice that has happened to the Jewish people all around the world through the Holocaust, but the people like the Palestinian people, who are the indigenous people of Palestine, should not pay the price. And we are Semitic people, so we cannot be against ourselves. And many people try to use it as a political tool in order to close the mouths of anybody who's trying to address the issue of colonialism, apartheid system that Israel is practicing on daily basis. So, we have to build on some of the important resolutions, as well as, for example, we Palestinians, the legal opinion given by the International Court the Hague Court on the wall really summarizes all the interrelated relationship between occupation, colonialism, and apartheid in understanding how a prolonged military occupation, it has emphasized that what we're talking about is a Zionist movement that has been built on at the expense of the rights of other people, preventing these people from the right to self-determination through expansion and colonialism, and through discrimination and divide to conquer policy that is still going on, and which all the Palestinians, whether those who are living inside Israel and are considered as Israeli citizens, or Palestinians living under occupation, suffer from. And it's a policy that is very clearly based on apartheid. And I think sometimes that colonialism and colonial expansion with controlling all our resources, natural resources, and using us as a labor force in Israel, or controlling our water, controlling our land, and all of that is a real manifestation of what an Israeli occupation, prolonged occupation, really all means, based on apartheid and based on dividing and conquering. And this is very clear in how they divide the occupied territory, how they isolate Jerusalem from all other parts of occupied territory, and so on. And the division that has been further manifested by Oslo Agreement, which has divided also the areas inside the occupied territories to area A, B, and C, and the Zim zone around Jerusalem, or H2 and the H1 area in the old city of Hebron. This division is really very much a way to create facts on the ground that further complicates the daily lives of Palestinian people in the occupied territory. Now, with the issue of the interrelated relationship between patriarchy and colonial occupation, there are numerous examples that you can really refer to our reports and submissions, because WICLAC brings in first-hand evidence from to make the voices of women living under occupation more heard, and they try to bring in those voices and in their reports and submissions always. And we have numerous reports and submissions that are available on our website, including the person who's doing her PhD on nitrates. We've done a lot of work on nitrates, on child home arrests, and how this is really psychologically and impacting women, preventing them from, emphasizing or re-establishing their traditional roles as housewives and mothers, and taking up the burdens of the arrest, becoming the prison guards of their own children, and abandoning their jobs because they have the less important jobs than the other members of the family, becoming the guardians and controlling their own children, at the same time trying to do all what they can to prevent the arrest of their beloved ones within the family. And this combined with gender-based violence, which women have to endure within a patriarchal society because of the occupation and the permit system and the restrictions of family reunification and revocation of residency rights to Palestinians, which make many women endure violence within the family. All of this is a long process that requires a lot of efforts, especially with the development of very conservative political right-wing parties that are trying to bring us back or try to prevent us from conducting that under the pretext of culture and religion and the specificity of our Islamic or Muslim society, which is the real problem of all our, it's a long process. And sometimes I lose, as a feminist and human rights defender, sometimes I lose hope But another time, I look at it and say, we are agents of change. We have to find new strategies and work with the younger generation in order to make change. It is the role now for Soha and Mariam to take over, because now the previous generation of women activists and feminists should give the way for the new generation with the new strategies, with working, using now new methods, especially the social media that is becoming very important, in order to be able to adhere change, and really that we should be only there for them if they needed us in order to support them to take the way forward in the future struggle for independence and our right to self-determination as Palestinian people, as well as to end all these very much entrenched patriarchal structures within our own society. Thank you. And I'm sorry if I've been too long on that.
Suha, if you want to add something.
I just kind of want to conclude and thank you all for organizing this very interesting and important event. I was also very privileged to be in the presence of Linda Samira. I feel strange calling her by her name because this is a professional setting. I call her by her name, but we usually go by Auntie or Khalto.
No, Habibti, no.
And it was, and it's a privilege for me to share the floor with you, of course, because you are definitely one of the women who have been at the center of the Palestinian feminist movement, whether by organized work or otherwise. So it has been really a privilege to share the floor with you and share the floor with Mariam as well, and to all of the organizers. I just kind of want to conclude by saying that something that caught my attention and always catches my attention whenever we are whenever we are invited or asked to be part of a panel to talk about women, the conversation naturally kind of diverts and concludes by the liberation from the apartheid regime and from the occupation. And this is something that is really important to keep in mind, because this is at the center of our struggle. And it reminds me of something that my mom always says. She tells me there's absolutely no full liberation without liberation from the occupation. And vice versa. We also cannot be liberated without being liberated inside, internally as well. But the occupation at this moment and the apartheid regime is the priority to be liberated from. And that doesn't negate the fact that we need to be liberated also as feminists. Which brings me to my next point, which also Mariam touched on. What is feminism? It is a concept that is different for me, different for probably Randa, Mariam. I am not representative of all Palestinian women and the feminist movement. Mariam isn't, as she declared as well. So it's an inclusive term, is the way that I like to think about it. And it bothers me sometimes that I am associated with like, oh, Suha, okay, you're gonna be talking about women and some. I'm not saying that this is bothering me. I'm just saying that the affiliation, the automatic affiliation, just because I studied gender studies in my BA like long time ago, doesn't mean that I understand also and that I can represent all experiences and all views. So this is something that is important to keep in mind as well. Even though I really had a great time despite the small glitch that we had there. I had a great time being at this event. And I just want to conclude by saying that, yes, the conversation always recenters around occupation. And this is a message for the international community and anybody who is not familiar with the Palestinian struggle, who was introduced today to different perspectives and different experiences, to keep in mind is that our main struggle here is to end the occupation, to end the apartheid regime, and to have the international community back us up with that, not for charity, because this is not charity work. This is an obligation. This is an obligation for the international community. This is not charity work for Palestine. And this is something that I always say when I speak. And I know that it sounds a little bit harsh, but it's not charity work. And this is something that we always have to make clear as Palestinians as well, because we're not looking for charity. This is not what we're looking for. We're looking for action. And action does not mean that we are removed from that action. As Palestinians, we are doing everything that we are doing. So in relation to the neo-colonialism point as well, we are not waiting for somebody to come and free us. We're not waiting for somebody to come and tell us what to do, because as Palestinians, a part of the Palestinian struggle and part of the resistance movement, we have done a lot, to say the least. The part that the international community is obligated to do is different. It's almost separated, but has to be done in coordination. And this is all I have to say in conclusion. And thank you so much for organizing again this event and for having me.
Thank you.
Thank you to all the panelists who, despite that minor glitch, decided to continue on with a very enlightening conversation and a very thought-provoking conversation. And I felt a conversation that, despite being out there in the public arena, is not nearly discussed enough. So I'll take this moment to express our profound gratitude for being a part of the panel tonight and for engaging in what was a very holistic analysis of a very important subject. I think all of your personal stories just reinforced what we already knew, but never felt so deeply before. Because having another person directly in front of you reiterate those points makes a lot of difference in any conversation. So, Ms. Senora, Professor Ramakrishnan, Mr. Rar, Ms. Barghouti, thank you very much for agreeing to be a part of this panel tonight, for being with us tonight, and to all the audience members who made the session very interactive, and to the entire team at Raisina House for organizing this very important event. But before we just wrap this event up, I'd like to give the floor to Professor Ramakrishnan to give his concluding remarks, and we can bid adieu.
Thank you, Saman. I don't want to end this with any particular assertion from my part. I really enjoyed listening to people who have experienced, first-hand experience with the struggle in Palestine, women's movement, the feminist assertions of various kinds, and therefore listening to them was very enriching. And they are reminding us, non-Palestinians from the international community, to respond to the situation they are facing, colonial apartheid regime that they are facing, and the ways in which their own patriarchal structures and colonialism collude in such a manner that women's lives become unbearable most of the time. But the credit to the Palestinian women that they've kept their critical and fighting spirit intact. I'm very happy that we have a meeting like this, and that's also an opportunity to express our solidarity with them. I thank Rights in Our House and Northeast Without Justice for coming together, and particularly those in Rights in Our House for giving me this opportunity. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you all for inviting us for this session.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have a good night and good evening.
Good night.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you. Bye-bye.